Greetings and welcome back to yet another discussion on my channel. I know I've had quite a bit of those recently. Hopefully there'll be more to come. Today I am joined by what could only be called a reasonable person on the left. That sounds these days a bit like an oxymoron, but it's not. I discovered this particular gentleman in an interesting context, and I think we'll get into a whole bunch of things in the realm of politics and other things. But one thing about him is that I noticed is that you could have a conversation, in my limited impression, that did not have any of the vitriol or the attempt at sort of one-upping, and I think that's so. Basically, the idea behind this conversation is to have a talk with somebody who you may or may not agree with, but in good faith, without lunging at each other's throats, which seems to be really, in the vast majority of cases, the tendency these days. So I will welcome Hunter here, and I guess one good way of well, actually, maybe you could talk about your ideas about the world first, and then we could get into some details. So you're on the left, a self-described person on the left. How would you describe yourself as being on the left, and how would you differentiate yourself from other people who say they're on the left, particularly in the mainstream?
Yeah, so just a brief summary of my sort of values and ideals. I'm very interested in giving people, giving everyone, I should say, the fairest opportunities that they can. I'm very equal opportunity, and I look at things like social democracy, and I see that there's great social mobility to come from it, and it's giving everyone a sort of baseline that I think is a good idea. And I'm very anti-capitalistic because I think that if the motivation is largely money, or is very, very much so in favor of money over people, that you're sort of, you're discounting something that I believe is important, which is people's well-being, and keeping that in mind. And the sort of foundation of my ideology is what's best for everyone. It's looking for the least of the evils in any given situation, and what that is determined by is what's best for everyone. And people on the left are generally we'll get into the issue with the air quotes progressiveness of the left, but there is a progressive element there which seeks to uplift and bring about some sort of equality. But there's issues with the progressiveness and the equality that we're going to talk about. But yeah, so very left economically, and I don't so much value. Actually, that's not quite the right thing to say. I value tradition, but I don't think tradition should be vied for as it is by the right, sort of treading on the interests of the people in general. But then again, you could say that the left is treading on the interests of the traditional. But yeah. So that's basically it. So I'm just general left, but quite strongly so. Yeah.
But how in your own words would you distinguish yourself? I mean, that you could say that's broadly a left-wing perspective, but what makes you different from what has become sort of mainstream left-wing these days?
Yeah. So for me, the main difference is that I think that I'm not afraid of certain things that people on the left are. There's this fear of it's a fear of scientific truths, really. It's and there's brainwashing that stems from it. There's this incorrect belief on the left that we are all equal, or that difference is negligible. Or you find in a lot of cases people on the left will equate acknowledging difference to believing that there is Yeah, they equate acknowledging difference to the belief that difference means difference in value as a person, which I don't believe. Uh, but you bring up the touchy subjects like difference between sex and difference between ethnicities and aggressive tendencies, or people who are disabled, and people on the left will get upset. They can't have these. This has been a problem for me personally, discussing with other people just on the left, is they can't have these discussions. They will. I personally don't believe that they should be touchy subjects, but they are. And
Briefly, my impression, and I've actually never been to that neck of the woods, but Oceania, no pun intended, by the way, for those looking for the literary reference, in Australia, New Zealand, your neck of the woods, people seem even more sensitive about this stuff over there than in other places. Maybe, do you feel that that's the case? Or is that just my misperception?
I think it's a bit of both. In some ways, I think because Australia and New Zealand are very multi-ethnic, I believe that a quarter of Australians are either the descendants of immigrants or immigrants themselves. I think like recent descendants, I mean. So yeah, it's very, very multicultural, and you look at certain cities and there's big representations of people from all around the world. And here in New Zealand, there's well, in both cases, there's the natives, but there's also like large populations of other immigrant demographics, and existing ones they're all part of what makes New Zealand New Zealand. They're just New Zealand people, but they all have different backgrounds. So there's a comfort in the multiculturalism that comes from there just being like a general good mix of people. But particularly in New Zealand, I'd say there's New Zealanders are relaxed, easygoing, and accepting people, but I think that they don't like strong opinions, and you don't actually see that many strong opinions here. And I think that you would likely not find many people agreeing with you or willing to engage in discussions on touchy subjects. Probably more so. I'm not sure. But yeah, I think that it comes in sort of different forms, because you'll see in Australia that there's a lot more racially charged, sexism charged discrimination that gets thrown around than here, and I think that people are less sensitive to it over there, but here they would be a lot more sensitive to it. And some of the language that I hear people use it's very hip, very stereotypical left, and I think that some of it's problematic because it's misguided in a lot of cases. So I think that New Zealand falls quite nicely into the stereotypical left, but it doesn't have so much of the extremes, if you know what I mean.
Well, I think Melbourne is sometimes cited as the epicenter of this sort of thing, leftist hipster culture. Getting back to your, these various points, whether it comes to disability or population differences or sex differences. I mean, it goes without saying. I mean, people know the reasons why, or do they? I'm not even sure. The left tends to be terrified of talking about these things, I think, because there's a fear of A, policy implications, and B, hurting people's feelings, and C, just that certain kinds of thoughts might be conjured up, and that might be these thoughts might be put into action, maybe. But
yeah,
it's the one thing I try to approach differences from just an objective and neutral position. I try to. I'm human. I'm limited, but I've always said that you can go out on the street in any place really, small town or city, and just see that some people are taller, other people are shorter, people look stockier, other people are fat. And it's just it's obvious that individuals are different, and then anyone who's attended a school, they all know the guy who was just knocking out those calculus equations, never needed any help with it, and the guy who needed to spend 2 hours after school getting tuition just to pass the calculus class.
Yeah.
Or, going to gym class and the guys dribbling the basketballs and shooting hoops nonstop, and the other guys who couldn't even dribble the ball properly. And so it's obvious that people are different. And whether people want to acknowledge it or not, at least in some realms, these differences are not only picked up on and detected, but they're actualized. So if you look at, and you're very much into athletics, but sports in general, anyone with a really genuine aptitude in something like, say, American football or basketball, that person might end up playing college basketball, and then that person might, if the person's good enough, be in the NBA. And it just so happens that 75% of the NBA is black. I don't think this is a coincidence, but I also don't think that the sky is falling because of this. And interestingly enough, when it comes to athletic performance, because I've noticed even Sports Illustrated has been doing this for at least a decade, it's okay to note, say, population differences in terms of athletic aptitude, and we're just talking about Usain Bolt, who's ultimately of West Africa, Jamaica, but West African origin, or East Africans who just dominate every long distance marathon they participate in, with a few outliers every now and then. But it's always, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya. It's just anytime London Marathon, it's always the same. And nobody gets worked up about that. And it's basically the people who have the aptitude are doing the jobs that they're best at, and nobody gets too upset about that. And at least in the realm of sports, people detect these differences in the sense that they note this person may be from this background, and they probably don't even care about the background, because in sports it's generally just about the competition. It's more coincidental. But then when we come to matters of economic success and cognition and all these other things, there are obviously discrepancies. And I would not person claim this is nothing is entirely genetic, but there's going to be a genetic element to everything, because every human beings and every animal is a combination of genes and environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that is really what tends to be the incendiary thing that gets people really riled up. I mean, a lot of this is a review for my subs and just people in general. But I don't really see that as big, to me at least, as big a deal as people, particularly on the left, do, because I'm not upset that 75% of the NBA is black, or every marathon is won by an East. But you could be. You could make up some. You could say, why there are no Koreans winning the London Marathon? Is that racist or?
Something that just a
go ahead.
Quick note on that. Something that I heard very recently that speaks to that misguided sort of mentality was the people were complaining about the representation of I think it was Africans in the Winter Olympics. Like, take a fucking guess why there's not a good representation there. And I don't think it's necessarily just the fact that a lot of these countries don't experience winter, or this actually might be a particularly bad example, but there's an environmental adaptation that is the reason behind why West Africans are fast and East Africans can run long distance, and Northern and Eastern Europeans are strong, and all these things, and there's this desire to sort of implant artificially whole groups in equal measure where it wouldn't naturally arise. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, absolutely. We see, and this is actually, I've seen Sports Illustrated, which is a mainstream magazine, talk about the rise of, you could say, population distinctions in athletic performance. You cited, weightlift. Most of the great weightlifters in the Olympics, they tend to be, of Eastern European or Northern European background. Look at the gymnasts.
Strongman competitions as well.
That
yeah.
too, yeah. Look at the gymnasts at the Olympics. Many, not all, are of East Asian background. And you see a stark distinction sometimes in just the proportion and distribution. And oftentimes, what you end up having really is say in long distance running, it's just a bunch of East Africans competing against each other. And
Yeah.
I think this is really the issue is more about how we react to these things, because I think I'm not of the belief that we can change this functionally or otherwise. I think that individuals and groups will have tendencies and different talents, and they will sometimes fall one way or the other, and it's how we react to it that is most important, because that's all we can do. I don't think the sky is falling, that Kenyans are dominating marathons, and I don't think it's the sky is necessarily falling that in certain socioeconomic categories certain groups outperform others, because it's pretty much the same ball game. It's basically people with different aptitudes doing what they tend to be good at. It's just that on the left, as you pointed out, it's the most toxic conversation you can have. And I hate to bring this up. I think I brought this up a couple of times already, but this recent talk between Sam Harris and Ezra Klein was very indicative of that, because the guy, Sam Harris, just asked, are people different? And Ezra Klein just goes on this long rant about slavery in the United States.
Yeah,
it wasn't even
entirely unrelated.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with that.
He wouldn't answer the question. He wouldn't engage in that conversation, and that's something that I see it as a problem. It's just this general unwillingness to. And I've asked people that I consider to be a bit more reasonable, but are still far left and they're very much leftist. I've asked them, why can't you talk about these things? And I think that there's this idea that if people who do discriminate, and people who do believe that people who are differently abled or of different skin color and this and that and the other, if they get hands on information that there is difference, that's dangerous. Get it, like the idea that having real information in circulation is dangerous, I think is just stupid. The truth should be the important factor. It should be something that's like, oh shit, we don't want to be real about this, because that might mean that some people might actually be justified in their discrimination.
Right.
They won't discriminate in the case of like the athletics. They know that there's this very obvious difference, and you can't attribute that to just hard work. Like I could work, I could work as hard as I liked, and I would never be, first place in men's 100 meters. And that's not just because, but yeah, you understand the reasons why. So, I'm not. There's differences on the individual level, but there's differences in population, and I don't understand why that's such a frightening concept. That there's a good reason for those differences, and you can't talk about that reason and then look into the reason behind and what
the issue is entirely one of, I think, of political concern, because you have the data or the facts, and that's one thing, that's one set, and then you have another set of concerns, and then there's another set of concerns that people will want to change policies based on certain things. And admittedly, I encounter people in my comment section and across the internet who will say that because there's some mean of a population that does X, we should therefore have this policy. I'm not really politically aligned, although I'm sympathetic to a hands-off approach, really, which is definitely not a left-wing approach, and it's also not really, well, some people would argue it's right-wing. Again, I think that it's okay to let the chips fall where they may. But, yeah, I can understand why people on the left would be concerned that as more and more differences are discovered between individuals and people in general, that this could be really alarming, because not everyone reacts to these things in a sober way. I'm pretty sober, but I don't. I mean, to me, it's obvious. It's as obvious to me as I go outside, short as I am with my 174 centimeters, and I see people who are 186 or 100. It's people are different, right? So I don't really spend a lot of time thinking, "Oh, wow, this is really incendiary and toxic," because that you just notice this thing. We were talking before we started the recording. One way anytime you start lifting, in a gym, that's one of the first places you notice that there are all these differences. Whether it comes to individual hormone levels and the rate at which you build muscle, type of muscle fibers, length, structure, muscle bellies, where your clavicles are, all of these things. It's so obvious. So I was just schooled in this, being below average in terms of that overall in athletics, specifically weightlifting. I learned about this early on. So none of this is shocking. So I don't really panic about this stuff. But there are people out there, understandably, who would think that we need completely revamped policies and changes. And in that sense, I can maybe not sympathize, but I can understand the left. But the one thing, and I'm sure you can pick up on this as somebody on the left yourself, the more you try to suppress discussion, the more the discussion is redirected to other corners of the internet in particular. And so you look at...
If you want to stop people from actually researching the difference as well, a lot of sociologists, they don't actually want the differences to be looked into. And the more you advocate for not having genuine, unbiased experts look into a subject matter, the more you're going to have other people who are aware of what's going on or are aware of these differences that are going to look into it, and they're going to, not likely do such a good job of it as experts. So I think we should delve into all the differences. I think we should, again, it's avoiding the truth of the matter. Keep searching for truths, wherever they can be found, and then you can make judgments based on, a better understanding of the picture. Yeah,
Oh, I absolutely know what you mean, and a good example of this is I don't know. I'm sure you know the alternative hypothesis. I don't know if you've heard, or this guy is obsessed. He's obsessed with sort of black-white differences, and every video he makes is about it. And really, I think most of his stuff is just one side of the story. And there can be and are alternative views, but he's the only one who wants to talk about this sort of thing. Maybe, you're a self-admitted autist, as in non-internet version autist, high-functioning autist. That might have something to do with this sort of, this your tolerance for saying, well, let's research this information, let's research the data. I honestly don't know it might be that there's just not, I don't think we can really do very much, or will not be able to do very much with understanding these things. But in theory, if we could understand these things to the best of our ability, we could just say, that's just the world is. Now, that's not a left-wing perspective, because I don't think we can fix the fortunes of people to the degree the left believes. Even so, for example, even if you had let's say everything were environmental and had nothing to do with genetics, you still couldn't create an environment, because we don't understand environmental influences well enough. You still couldn't create an environment where where you could perfectly control for every variable to get the outcomes that people on the left tend to want to have. I mean, that's a separate discussion. Probably should go down there a bit later. But I'm curious, when you, as a person on the left, who's reasonable, how do people on the left react to you? People who share your policy vision, or at least the general thing, your social vision, but just are really reactive and not in a good way to talking about the facts of the world.
Yeah, there's levels to it, just as there's levels to these sort of things that leftists get afraid about. Like if you talk about physical differences, and you bring this topic up with as a leftist with other leftists, they'll acknowledge that, and they'll think, but they'll usually say, I don't think it's that important. And usually I agree with them. I don't think it's particularly important that there's varying physical capability outside medical implications, but I don't think everyone has to be a certain way physically. I'm aware that there's a stratification of it, there's specializations of it, there's aptitudes and inaptitudes, and you bring up this, and generally they'll say, there's physical differences between the individual, between ethnicity, and this means certain things, and they're not bothered by that. But then if you bring up something like something that I had to learn about recently was IQ. I sort of learned about what IQ was and how IQ tests are made, and the implications of your score on that. And the moment you bring up IQ and race, good luck finding anyone that on the left that will actually entertain that conversation. But something I've done recently is I brought up just general difference, and I took labels out of the picture, and I made this sort of the discussion quite ambiguous, but also in reference to certain examples. And I spoke about populations and how warlike they are, and I think I asked them do you think that this particular warlike population or population has a warrior culture historically? Do you think the fact that they have this high representation of say certain physical features, it's a stupid meme to bring up, but there's truth in it. There's that meme going around of the warrior skull versus the gay alien skull, and you'll find that there's more.
I'm not familiar
skulls.
with that one. Can you?
Okay, so it's one of these things that sort of exists on a spectrum, but you can definitely see it, and it's the warrior skull is strong, square, jutting jaw, flat face, heavy brow, sloped forehead, typical brutal masculine skull shape with flat back to the head, and these people can genuinely sustain heavier blows to the head, and typically they quite often have thick necks as well, stuff like this. They can genuinely sustain heavier blows to the head without ill effect. And and if you live in an environment that promotes for warrior features physically or mentally, either or, you're going to see over time that it will be selected for, because the people that suit the environment will be more successful overall. And this shows with populations that have a higher representation of the warrior skull. Here down in Oceania, you look at the natives of New Zealand and the Polynesians, and they have a strong representation in contact sports and fighting sports, because they're fucking big, strong people that look like warriors. And historically, the Polynesians have very strong warrior cultures, and it's and their competition was highly valued. And when you live in a small space geographically with a lot of competition, and the food is actually pretty good. There isn't so much of a shortage of food, especially in the case of the tropical places. you'll see natural warriors arise. And so I discussed this thing about uh, uh, warriors, and I discussed with a few actually quite well-educated people in certain cases, and a few ordinary people, and they were sort of they nodded their head and they said, "Yeah, I can definitely see the sense in that." And then another point to add to this, the sort of the sense of this warrior skull thing. So it sounds a bit retarded because it does come from a meme, but it's also a meme based partially on reality. You've heard about face shapes and representations in prison, right?
Mm.
If you look at the military, you look at contact sports, you look at prisons, you will see this warrior face. You will see a square face with a strong jaw and a particular head shape.
Yeah,
And
do you know Jocko Williams?
Jocko Willink is a fucking perfect example.
I was about to say, I instantly thought, oh yeah, that's the guy. Yeah, Jocko Wilkins, that's his name. Jocko Wilkins, I think. Yeah. Yeah, he's a.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that guy. Yeah, for sure. He's a Navy SEAL, and if you listen to his political, he was so he what did he do? He did MMA. He does Brazilian
jiu-jitsu.
He's physically active. Was a
marksman. Everything. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So all this very archetypal male warrior stuff, and his political policies usually. Well, from what I've seen anyway, usually involve, we need to go to this place, deal with these dangerous people by killing.
Yeah, you kill a problem to deal with the problem. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And, you can't look at that man and tell me that he isn't a warrior by nature.
Yeah.
And that the nature part's important there, because it's not nurture. So you bring these things up with leftists, and they nod their head, and they can see the point. But then, it depends what you bring up, like I said. And there's different levels to it. So sometimes you'll see people who like me, just completely entertain the idea that ethnicities are different, sexes are different. That's another one that is. I think that the sex discussions for me is one that has brought up like the widest variety in responses, because there's obvious differences. And personally, I see the differences as, funnily enough, complementary. Masculinity and femininity are complementary. And there's a few people that I've spoken to, for sure, who are politically left, who acknowledge the differences. And they think that acknowledging that the difference is fine, but you don't sort of discriminate where it's not due based on that. And then there are some people who they don't even want to acknowledge that there is a difference between males and females, and that's probably one of the areas where you see the most ridiculous sort of denial of reality in regards to the fact that we are not all equal, is the male-female debates. So yeah, it depends a lot on what you ask, because there's certain topics that I think invoke a lot more fear and aversion for even bringing up or engaging in the discussion.
And the way I look at it is that we're all winners and or losers in a cosmic lottery to varying degrees. I mean, it's very unlikely, but it's entirely possible that you could get, you could end up a Jocko Wilkins, this super warrior, super athletic, talented, and then also, I don't know, get the mind of a Richard Feynman, and it's very unlikely, but it's possible. And that person would be extremely blessed, and then you could just end up on the other end, and you could be the type of guy who struggles to hold down a job at Starbucks or McDonald's, and so I think if we could ever get past we can't talk about this, it's just toxic, and just acknowledge that people, through no fault or merit of their own, some people got luckier than others, then we could have a discussion, a good faith discussion about policy and what to be done, what could be done about that. And there would be differences, because people on the right wouldn't agree with people on the left, and more centrist people would, like myself, would have their own views. But we have to get to that stage where we can discuss these things without it being incendiary. And I have found in my own life, I've effectively lost friends over just discussing these things. So for example, I'm the type of person who's willing to really talk to almost anyone within reason, as long as they're not frothing at the mouth maniacs, left or right, whatever the viewpoint might be, and just listen to them for a while. But then there's an expectation that in some circles that I automatically offer pushback, even and many times I don't agree with them. I'm not on the left, and I don't agree with a lot of those policies, but it's more important to hear people out oftentimes. And because I don't offer immediate pushback and don't do the whole group identity, in this case sort of a political tribe almost, that I'm somehow complicit in racism or supporting racism or whatever. And the tribalism, whether it's ethnic or political, it's so rampant now that people are losing their ability to actually listen to the words people are using, the things they're saying, and they're just interpreted and the way they want to see things as opposed to the way they actually are, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, can I speak on this just briefly?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, okay, so again, it sort of comes back to that thing that I said earlier about the equating. Well, when leftists equate the acknowledgement of differences to the belief that difference means difference in value as a person, and then they hear you say something that they don't personally like, and like you said, you can lose friends over that. You can lose the ability to ever make a compromise or benefit from hearing the other side of the story because you just don't want to hear it. An example of somebody that I hear them say things, and I agree with some things, find certain things interesting, and then just wholeheartedly disagree with other things, is Jordan Peterson, who's been quite a controversial topic at the moment. I like what he says about behavioral psychology. I was suggested to him by a couple of friends of mine because they drew similarities between things that I say and things that he says. And then when I went and listened to some of his videos, I actually heard him saying almost word for word things that I say, which I I like that. But it's not just because he has very similar ideas about certain things, and especially in regards to self-improvement, because I'm a health fanatic, and part of that is mental for me. So I have this natural compulsion to teach and pass on what knowledge I've found out about improving myself to other people. So that's why I got suggested to him. But yeah, so I agree with his behavioral psychology and his self-improvement, and then he brings up certain things that really get me thinking, but other things I just completely disagree with. But as as you described, I'm reasonable about it. You're not going to agree with everyone on every point.
What do you disagree with, for example?
He demonizes leftist intentions, and I think he sort of puts too much value in traditions. I just hear the odd thing that he says, and it just I couldn't really think of any specific examples, but particularly the demonizing of intentions on the left. He says, I know why leftists act this way. They act this way because of these things. Like he talks about when leftists say that wasn't real communism, for example, or something, or real socialism, whatever. And he says that they say that, and what they mean by that is that if I was dictator, I'd lead the world into utopia. It's not. He does things like that where he makes sweeping statements about a very large group of people, and it's quite a demonizing thing to say. And I don't pretend that I'm even suited for a position of leading the world into utopia. That's actually quite a ridiculous thing to say. There are some, for sure, who think that, if I had that power, I definitely wouldn't be corrupt. I doubt myself in the ability to avoid corruption. For example, I'm being real, but there's other things where he sort of, the reasoning that he gives is that leftists they're jealous or they're angry about certain things, and it's just lashing out. It's not the case. I know a lot of leftists exist on their own spectrum as well, of sort of intentions. There are those who are they're not well informed, they're tribal, and for them it's just the same as a lot of their opposition, which is just standing underneath a banner which has my team, whatever that team may be, written on it, and just fighting out from underneath that banner, because that's a natural sort of thing to do, is to compete to refine ideas, but they don't even know what their ideas are. So that's an example of me as a leftist hearing somebody he's right wing, right? I think he's quite traditional and right wing. I hear him, and he is technically my political enemy. We're in opposition, but I see the value in other things that he has to say. I don't disregard him as a person, which a lot of leftists do. They hear that he's conservative, and he does say some strange things. I believe that he definitely does say some inaccurate things, but I also think that he says accurate things and useful things. I hear that, and I think, cool, I'll take the good, and we can.
This is a consequence of where we are today, where kind of, well, it's different forms of identitarianism. In this case, it's political. The political tribe, there are racial versions of it too, where all you are is whatever group you've been lumped into. You may not even belong to the group. So I've been on YouTube for a long time, many years now, and I've been called everything. I've been called a Marxist, which is absurd.
This is the funny thing that arises.
I've been called far right. I've been called libertarian. I've been called on the left, centrist, racist, not white supremacist. Everything you could imagine, because everything needs these days, at least, to be in some category that makes sense to other people, because you don't want to deal with the nuances and complexities of people or them as individuals as part of a group. I mean, I agree that there are group dynamics, but to use that as the sole metric for judging a person, it's folly. But that's where we are right now. So that's what the left is doing. That's what other people do. They say, "Oh, you're black, therefore you're this, you're that, you're that, whatever. You're right wing." It's not very productive, and it shuts down. But here's the thing: it shuts down conversation. You need to have the conversation, because the only way you're going to get anything done is to compromise. But if you can't talk to somebody, you can't have a compromise. All you get is this pigeonholing. And I'm at the point of, I think I've been driven almost insane about this, just because I can't seem to have a conversation with people without this taking place, where the other person is completely demonized, or I'm demonized, or it's very frustrating. But
it's almost the root of the big issues, is that it's the important thing about open, honest discussion about things, is because in the case of, like, that's a thing that arises. You see that if you talk about politics long enough, you're gonna be around to hear people call you you're playing enemy bingo, right? You fall everywhere on the spectrum according to people in general, because they hear the one negative thing that they equate to a particular enemy, their enemy, and they're not willing to see past that, have the real honest discussion. They don't say, well, a lot of people don't say, this is we're talking about problematic people here, people who don't want to have the genuine discussion. They see that one thing and they say, oh, you're you believe that there's a difference between ethnic populations and IQ, so you're a racist, you're right wing, whatever. and then they don't actually sit down and they don't ask you, why do you think that's the case, or like, what does that mean to you? They won't actually hear the meaning in what you're saying. They hear a signal to them that you're the enemy.
Yeah.
And then they jump on you for that.
I mean, this is hyperbolic. Oh, so you think that some people are taller than other people? You must hate short people.
Yeah, we're starting to see ridiculous shit like that. People who this is another thing that I think is an issue with the left, is brainwashing in brainwashing that sort of surrounds the fears of the common fears of the left and things that they don't want to talk about, and that you do actually have people say genuinely mad things, like there's no difference between males and females, that there's no such thing as male or female tendencies, and I can't. It's mind-boggling to me, because you can just see and observe, and you can just be aware of passively without looking for it very obvious differences. But then again, the equation that acknowledging difference is believing that if people have difference, that there's some sort of difference in value as a person there, but there isn't. They just have this fear of that.
Well, that's the thing. That's your view. There are other people, admittedly, and you could say that in this case that the left-wing's fears are justified, would say that there are people who do think that one's value is or could be based on that.
Right. Disagree, but
yeah, well, it's not even necessarily my view. I'm just saying that there are people who think that, and I could posit a hypothetical scenario where I could probably force you. So let's say there was some impending war, and the only people who really were who could help us in this would be, huge brain nibbas who really know, say, nuclear physics. You would objectively, in such a case, say in that context that those people will be more valuable than you or I. Right?
Yeah.
But I mean, again, that's an extreme example. I don't think that, in a political sense, it's very useful to delineate people's values based on their innate capacity, at least in terms of how we treat them as a general guideline. Because when we go past the superficial politics, we do treat people differently based on all kinds of differences, environmental, intrinsic, or otherwise. It's just a fact. For example, people don't talk about this, but if you're on the taller end throughout your lifetime, you're probably going to make about 15% more income than somebody on the shorter end of the spectrum, just in terms of income. Yeah. That's a value judgment. It's a value judgment you can see materialize in economic gains, and yet people aren't up in arms about that. And I'm not complaining about that as somebody on the shorter end of the spectrum necessarily. It's just that we don't want all of these inherent biases to be codified necessarily in law. I think I would agree with that, because that creates all kinds of problems and disharmony. Because we have enough of these biases on the ground in day-to-day life that it's enough to deal with. But yeah, I would agree with you that that wouldn't be a very useful approach. I try to look at things in terms of useful, not useful. But yeah, I mean, there could be people who would suggest that, and in that sense, the left might be justified. But again, there's no way you can get around observing differences. Even going back to the tall short thing, I mean, if I think you said you're pretty tall. What, you're 187 or
193? Yeah.
Yeah. So you're as they would say these days, a tall ass nibba, right? You can reach things I can't reach at 174 centimeters.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
On the other hand, I mean, I don't mean to break the news if you're unaware, but there's an increased likelihood for you developing certain types of cancer being at that height that I'm less likely to, because...
Yeah, or just, I think, just living a shorter life in
yes,
general.
For example. So and this is just due to the fact that you have more cells in your body, you're taller. I don't see. This is why I don't think it's a very artful game the left is playing, because nobody's going to be able to dodge these. It's because it's the simplest things of just noticing people are taller or shorter, right? That even has an impact on your income, on health outcomes, all these things. And we need to somehow get to a place where we can just talk about these things in a sober way without people just flipping their lid and either suggesting insane policies that would balkanize and destabilize society to insane degrees, or just ignoring it, just pretending that there's no elephant in the room, or not even multiple elephants.
Yeah,
but
there's a I wonder if some people have a difference in sort of distinguishing between, because I mean like difference as a person, but obviously in the case of, say, like that survival scenario where we need nuclear physicists, we need really fucking smart people to solve the problem, and like now they're super valuable people at the time, but they're not valuable as necessarily more valuable as a person. They aren't inherently more valuable as an entity just in general than anyone else, but they are more valuable certainly
contextually they're more valuable. I would say
contextually they have a lot of important differences to other people, and that's where it is important, is contextually in certain cases, like medical fields, for example. But this doesn't mean that we're not playing StarCraft at the societal level here, right? We're not valuing like different people.
Well, you're the Stellaris expert, so maybe.
Yeah, we're not. I know leftists that play StarCraft, and when they do it, they play like highly stratified societies and genocidal maniacs. I do that myself. In the real world, I value all people as people equally, but in context that they're more valuable. It's like, if you had to say to me, there's two people. These people both have trained for the 100 meters, the same amount of time. They have the same amount of interest in it, and this and that and the other. And something depends on that. And somebody says to you, who would you put your money on? And like one of them was West African, and the other one was Central European. I'm going to, without having to think about it too much, I'd say that the West African's probably going to win, or at least in my opinion, there's a good chance. There's a higher chance that they could win if the other variables are the same, right? And yeah, I can see in fact, I've actually seen right wingers do this as well, where they sort of have this fear that the deep state Jews at the top are going to turn society into like a 16 caste system where everybody has varying levels of rights, like a Stellaris player might incorporate different alien species, and that's all. This alien species is strong and industrious. We'll send them to mining worlds. Like, that's not realistically going to happen. And it's not realistically going to happen with just the sheer number of people that we have and the varying opinions. But also, I wonder if there's the fear of that. But on the other hand, it might be that they find it that certain people don't even realize that people distinguish between contextual value and inherent value.
Well, I think we automatically do this. And anytime you have a marketplace of whether ideas or needs and demands, I mean, a quote-unquote free market, whatever, people with different aptitudes are going to be more in demand than other people. And then there is that contextual bias. If you want to apply for a job in a company that requires several programming languages, you don't have that knowledge and the aptitude to learn those languages, I mean, you're kind of out of luck, because that's the way that works. But I think not only is it impractical not only is it, I don't think a good overall policy, but I think you couldn't have a overarching political system, given the state of the world now, at least, that that use that contextual bias from a top-down perspective. It's just too big a place right now. We already have all these contextual biases and recognition of differences in our interactions, economically and otherwise. I think general guidelines are better. And whether or not I agree with the idea of people having inherent value or not, pragmatically speaking, I would say that's probably a better approach than others. Of course, even me not wholeheartedly agree with you in that case, at least not just sort of jumping on exactly the same bandwagon would get me into trouble in certain circles. But this is the problem, and I don't see any improvement, Hunter, in the way this is going. I'm seeing more and more balkanization and people just escaping to the far corners of sometimes it's called the deep net or whatever. I don't know what it's called sometimes.
Yeah, they find echo chambers.
Well, yeah, the echo chamber. Flat earthers who are just completely convinced of their worldview, which all incidentally oftentimes is less about flat earth and more about them just, finding like-minded people.
Their tribe.
People. And this is something that people on the left need to. I mean, they engage in it to huge degrees to acknowledge. But most people, and I think this is something you and I, for all our differences, have in common. We don't really have a sense of tribal identity. At least based on things you've said before and other discussions. You don't really feel particularly attached to any tribe, and neither do I, political or otherwise. That is. That you and I, as non-tribal people, need to acknowledge, unfortunately, this is another aspect of reality, that most people, maybe not most, many people, maybe many or most people, and or most people, have this deep-seated need of tribal affiliation.
Right, but I think that even, the reason behind the tribes is the sort of valuing, right? I can acknowledge values, and there are definitely things that, for non-objective reasons, I want more and I value more. But I don't sort of let that get in the way of me rationalizing the situation, if you know what I mean. Like I don't think that because let's say I have different tastes in the arts or something like that. Like I like different music and art styles, stuff like that. And there's certain things that I'd want a preference for. This is like a low importance example of it. I don't get angry at people who like different, types of art, or I don't think that my art is inherently more, is inherently more valuable overall. I'm well aware of the fact that people value different things. But I will still work towards things that suit my preference, and I don't think that that's an unreasonable thing to do. And then when you escalate that to like the tribal level, it's like you might say the left in general, which is a very nebulous thing, is sort of like a tribe for me. But I don't disregard the sort of the differences in value person to person, and I'm unlikely to find people that share specifically my view. But yeah, I think it's possibly advantageous to seeing the truth of the matter. I mean, it is, if you think about research, biased research as opposed to unbiased research. But it's possible for people who are heavily biased in certain contexts to engage in completely non-biased behavior. And I think that it's partly down to sort of, I mean, it's a fear of being wrong is something that a lot of people have, for sure. And I like to surround myself by lots of different opinions, and even antipodean opinions in some cases with the people that we've been, speaking. The circumstances we met under were those people who have like completely different opinions to me. I like to be around it to hear the meaning from their side. I don't just immediately label them as an enemy. I might label them as a political enemy, but I'm like, what do they have to say? I do that listening thing we were talking about earlier on, reasonable about it, because sometimes I'm proven wrong. There's been several times throughout my life where I've had like a lengthy discussion that's gotten a bit heated with some people, and then they've just hit me with something. I'm like, fuck, you are absolutely right. And I've said to them like, actually, no, I agree. I've changed my opinion now. I'm gonna have to take a break from this, and like, I thank you for informing me of this, and I'm gonna rethink what I know now, because this is important issues as far as I'm concerned, because I'm largely interested in people. That's like a people, nature, biology, that sort of stuff is all like is my sphere of special autistic interest, the things that I'm in part obsessed about. So yeah, this is an issue as well as this fear of being wrong as well, and there's more wrongs that can arise from sort of confining yourself to a tribe, because if you're like in the case of flat earthers, everyone thinks you're a fucking mental write-off because you believe that the earth is flat, and if you think that everyone who thinks that is wrong, that you're thinking most people are wrong. Do you know what I mean? That there's this if there's any inquisitive flat earthers, they tend not to be flat earthers for very long, because they will hear some quite convincing points as to why the earth isn't flat, you fucking idiot,
Yeah. Well, yeah, I want to hear a variety of views. I mean, sometimes it doesn't really. Well, I think Alexander Sangmore, I experienced him recently for the first time. That's a good example of it's a waste of time. But yeah, because sometimes you can learn things, and in dealing with all kinds of political polarities and different people, I've kind of honed my own centrism on many issues. So I'll deal with people who are very individualist or individually minded, and I am too, but then try to impart to them that not everyone is like that. In fact, most people aren't like that. So if we want to talk about the world, most people do view it from this tribal perspective, strongly aligned. We all have tendencies, but I mean, people belonging to political camps and ethnic camps. And this is something that, on the one hand, concerns me, because I wish the world weren't that way, but it does appear to be that way. People do seem to devolve into some kind of tribal allegiance. Sometimes it's purely political, sometimes it's purely ethnic, sometimes usually it's a combination of both. But to not acknowledge that, I think is very dangerous. And there's another thing that I think is people who are...
Might be a self-awareness issue as well, yeah.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, and most of the people I'm friends with, and I guess you could say in my tribe, are the people who tend to be very individualistic, think, oh, well, I'm not like that, so I'm not going to worry about it. But the problem is most of the people aren't like that. Most of the people have strong tribal allegiances of whatever sort, religious, political, ethnic. You could see, for example, the failure to understand this in various foreign escapades last decade or two. In Iraq, not understanding the various tribal, ethnic divisions. This happened historically in Vietnam. So whether or not you personally feel these things, you need to, I think, take note of them. I'm not sure what the solution is, but I do know that most people aren't like me in that regard, or they're not like you. And we see this. People, they go to their echo chambers. They view the world in terms of purely through group dynamics. And that seems much more the norm than it is our view. I dare say our view is a tiny, not even just small, but a tiny minority. And then there's a somewhat scary thought that arises from that we might need to work with a world or a landscape that is that way, where we constantly, as much as we want to look at people as individuals, and that's what I always do, that's not how the world operates, because most people operate along group dynamics. You'll get exceptions, of course, and this is one of the major concerns I have with the world in the future, is that there's that, it's kind of a meme people make fun of. It's mostly the alt-right makes fun of it, but some individualism. Well, some of us are individualists, but it doesn't really seem very reflective of the world at large, because most people aren't.
Still shares, close proximity with lots of people. With they have to make interactions. Humans aren't, just a set of individuals. They're a collective. It's a social, communal species. You have to consider the bigger picture. And that's even just doing that is a step towards just generally informing yourself. You need to be aware that there's these, most people aren't going to agree with you, but then you also need to be aware of the fact that, what are the reasons behind most people not agreeing with you? And if everyone had that sort of inquisitive nature, or they were just, for example, I actually find politics quite off-putting. It's the things that are talked about, and the fact that I keep finding people making certain decisions or certain policies in place. Politics is really fucking annoying. But I try to educate myself about it because it's relevant to me. The individualist will still have to account for other people, and this tribe will still have to account for this other tribe, especially if there's an issue that they can't just solve by being angry at each other, right? You can't do that. Humans are so populous. There's billions of us now, and there might even be millions in the same small area. So we have all these tons of overlapping tribes, and if we all inform ourselves, just even on the individual level, informing yourself as much as possible is extremely beneficial to you. If you inform groups of other groups, motives and values and the reasons why they're doing certain things, it allows for this important, open, honest discussion about matters that make for contention, right? And you're always going to have conflict. You're always going to have competition. You're always going to have dissenting opinion. But it's how you treat that climate of all that. You dress for the weather, right? You don't just. I like wearing this. I like wearing comfortable clothes, but if it's cold as shit outside, I'm not gonna fucking walk outside in my boxers, am I? It's you can't really just detach yourself from the situation entirely.
No, but I've noticed that's a strong tendency in individually minded people, that to do just that, and not to be aware of group dynamics, or the fact that most people see themselves as being part of a group. This is in the United States. I couldn't really comment on New Zealand or Australia. Something that people have for decades now failed to observe, that the country has been balkanized into groups that view each other as competitors, but nominally, politically, there's this idea that everyone's an American and therefore an individual, but that's not on the ground how it seems to operate.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think I have a good analogy for this, actually. This balkanization. If we take it to the smallest possible level of division, from one entity to two, right? And there's contention between two entities. Think of a relationship, like between two people, right? Partners. They're not going to agree on everything. Sure, partners are usually, in agreement on most things, but there's not going to be two people on this planet out of all the billions of people that agree on everything. There will be some contention somewhere, and it's what you do with that. But a really, really, really important tool for working out the differences and coming to an optimal compromise is to communicate. And you'll find that couples where they don't communicate effectively, or they communicate in terms of my opinion versus your opinion, not actually, they're talking past each other, like they're just throwing out attacks and throwing out defense in response. They're not actually listening for the meaning. Those relationships don't work, and you can extrapolate that to the tribe. And so we're seeing all these schisms growing, and it's very obvious in the US. But go on.
Yeah, because in the U.S., the term American has been, it's not, well, to say that it's not well defined is a bit of a euphemism, but for too long there's been this term American. Nobody really wants to define it anymore. But when you look at the ground, I just see dozens of divisions. You have what's sometimes now called the coastal elites, these sort of wealthy cognitive elite of the West and East Coast who live in their own little bubbles, tend to be very far left. Middle America tends to be far removed from that, mostly white. You have different ethnic groups that have balkanized away. I mean, you go to places in New York City where I grew up, and you'll get neighborhoods where nobody speaks English because it's all Hispanic, and so on and so forth. So I don't really know. I honestly don't know how to deal with that. I don't think you can deal with it by saying, we all need to be individuals, because that is not going to resonate with those people.
Think about the couple analogy again. If a counselor that they've gone to for their problem says, you two should just be individuals, that's not fixing the problem. You have that relationship going. We're forced into a relationship with all the different interrelating groups. And individualism has its place, but you need to you share your environment with all these people, and like we've discussed, most people aren't going to agree with you on certain things. And I think the more that we talk about the touchy stuff, the less touchy it will become, because we'll be aware of each other's.
Well, it gets boring after a while, or boring, maybe not, but it just it becomes less impactful. When you've gone from A to Z through most of these differences and what have you, as I've tried to, I just don't find it all that remarkable. Nothing really shocks me. It all seems to fall in line with what you can just observe in reality, oftentimes. The best case scenario going forward in the future seems to me with this thing I call the tolerant society, where my neighborhood, where I live in Germany, and I actually saw this growing up in New York City too, where people of different, mostly in this case ethnic, in some cases religious persuasions, not really associating with each other and mostly going out of each other's way, but when interactions were forced, they would tolerate each other. So if you're at the supermarket and you're in the queue, the Hispanic guy wouldn't talk to the Irish American guy, and neither would talk to the Jewish guy, and the Jewish guy wouldn't talk to the black guy, but nobody would attack each other. That's kind of the best case scenario I see going forward.
Agree to disagree.
It's well, is it? Yeah, well, it's not even that. It's just nobody really wants to deal with each other, but sometimes you're just sort of forced to. But
But
no one's
that's a
actively
lot more
harming each other.
constructive than
Yeah.
schisms forming. It's not like there's activism or
The danger of this, though, is the reason why people aren't in these situations, these divisions aren't harming each other. It all goes back to resources, because nobody is starving. When people start starving, I mean, wars have been fought over water. When people start starving, when there's not enough water, when food and shelter is not in abundance, that's when the tolerant society, as I call it, of, well, we don't actually like each other, but if we have to stand in the supermarket queue, okay, fair enough. That's when that starts breaking down, and you don't get that tolerance anymore. Instead, you get violence. And so I'll give you an example. In the early 90s in LA, there's these famous things, the LA riots. And so what we saw were people from different ethnicities looting and pillaging various shops, many of them owned by quote-unquote Korean Americans. And some of them owned guns. Now, that was a minor example in the big grand scheme of things, but it just shows that when order breaks down, the tolerant society breaks down. People don't tolerate each other that much. And so maybe the discussion we should be having, because these are just my own thoughts or my own opinions, is resource management, really, because I'm of the view at this stage that whatever grand vision people have to return to the past, traditions, it's not going to happen because we're in the here and now. And the here and now is a world that is, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective, I will comment on neither, globalized, of people mixing, whether it's reproductively, politically, or otherwise. Everything is just mixed up, and that's the circumstance we're living under. So,
yeah, that's unavoidable.
Right.
But,
if that's the case, and the best we can achieve for people who have strong tribal identities is a kind of passive tolerance of each other, but not no strong bonds and not that much interaction. And I think on this front, the left is delusional because people avoid each other, as we've been talking about now for a while. How we manage resources and resource distribution, and then there are all kinds of discussions that arise from that, UBI and et cetera. But that's the thing. I think that the real issue going forward is how we can manage the resources, because if we don't do it well, that's when we're going to get potentially dangerous and lethal conflict between groups that at the current. So, for example, in my neighborhood, you have Turkish people and Arab people and German people, and none of them have anything to do with each other beyond, as I said, this scenario where they're standing in the supermarket queue. And not even that in some cases, because the organic supermarkets are not populated by the Arabs and the Turkish people. It's mostly German people, quote-unquote white German people. Everyone, quote-unquote, gets along because there are enough resources to go along. But what would happen in this microcosm if there were not enough resources? Well, you would get division and conflict and people fighting each other, and it probably would break down along religious, ethnic lines, probably.
What you brought up about this is that, like, the left not willing to acknowledge this. I mean, I know that a lot do, but your average. This is the thing, is about the average person not considering things, but the average left winger isn't going to consider that. And also, in some cases, they aren't willing to acknowledge the destructive element of human nature. Humans are by nature tribal killers. We're working away from that. We're actually progressing really quite fast and nicely, as far as I'm concerned. We're doing well, but let's keep that trend up. And especially in a time where we're seeing a lot of schisms growing, we could see, probably a lot of unwanted contention, violence, or bloodshed, or even, wars in certain cases, maybe. But yeah, it's a denial of reality or perhaps a lack of knowledge to not account for the the destructive element that could arise from you know, animals, human animals competing for resources, which is why I think that we should really work to build a sort of, if you heard a term put like post-scarcity society. I believe that we have enough resources, knowledge, and manpower and know-how, but still it's going to be difficult to implement. But that would get rid of some of that, resource competition. Animals do that, and quite often the loser of those resource competitions suffers some sort of ill fate. Usually in nature it's death, but humans, it can also be death, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think this is something that, again, I think resource management is the name of the game. Specifically, you say financial resource management, with what I call the great cognitive displacement, which is one of the biggest issues, maybe the biggest issues, of people being completely left behind through the misfortune of being born, frankly speaking, too dumb for a world of increasing complexity. There could be some serious issues arising from that. And I actually don't even view that as a political issue, because you could frame it politically, but if the world increasingly is divided into a situation of haves and have-nots, you're left with a couple of options. Maybe the haves, if they're particularly draconian, will just put down the have-nots. But if you want to maintain the illusion of the tolerant society, then the have-nots need to be given something that they can have, whether they quote-unquote earn it or not, because otherwise you will get that conflict. Most conflicts you see are a matter of haves versus have-nots, oftentimes framed through another lens. One thing I've cited on occasion is, historically, for centuries now, there's been an ethnic minority population in Southeast Asia of various Chinese ethnicities that dominate the market there. They control sometimes upwards of 70% of the financial flow there, capital there, and they tend to be one to, in best case scenario, I think in Thailand they're 10%, I believe, but a very small percentage, usually below 5%. Tremendous ethnic conflict there, but really, what the reality is, it's a matter of resources and people having things and other people not having those things. I think people are missing the mark when they're not focusing on this particular issue of resource management, specifically financial resource management. Because because I think this cognitive stratification is going to be the big thing moving forward, and it's going to alienate a lot of people. And if we don't want to talk about that, and talking about that entails acknowledging, whether it's at the group level or individual level, that some people are smarter than other people, and the smarter people are going to do better, and they're going to leave behind the dumber people, for lack of a better term, we're screwed. So
this is something that one of the German speakers brought up with me. Here's an example of where somebody who on the right could benefit somebody on the left. Is that whole situation was explained to me, and because he sort of talked me through. He asked me about what my idea on equal opportunity and giving everyone, no matter who you are, this like basically the fairest shot in life you can. Acknowledging all the things we talked about, all the differences that are just going to happen, that are absolutely unavoidable, and he sort of like prompted me to talk through the process that would result from that, and he explained that you are going to see this cognitive stratification, and what does that mean? And as far as I'm concerned, so long as everyone is given that fairest of chances, that the best opportunity, all the tools that they need to do the best that they possibly could, that's entirely up to them. that cognitive stratification, it will be a challenge. A lot of people aren't going to like that, but personally, I'm not going to be particularly upset that I might be in a different tier, but they're to say people who are, you know, top tier or like the top few tiers. They're going to, that you will see, yeah, definitely this resultant natural sort of stratification as the you know, the more intelligent rise to the top, and those there are people who have no gifts. They could be you know, on the lower end of the bell curve in shitloads of cases, and to me, those are still just as valuable as people. But yeah, they're going to fall to the bottom of the stratification that would arise from equal opportunity, and you know, what then? I don't know. That's just how things are, as far as I'm concerned. As long as you've given everyone the best possible, fairest opportunity, you're just going to have to live with the reality at the end of the day. And that's the thing. Look at the bigger picture. Acknowledge resource competition, acknowledge human nature, acknowledge inherent differences physically and mentally, and acknowledge the existing climate as it is, what's happened in past, where we're going, shit like that. Life isn't fair. It never will be fair. It's not. I don't actually know if it's possible for it to be fair.
I would agree with you wholeheartedly. I'd say that it's not possible, you know, in the best of worlds, to ever reach a place where life could be fair. And my concern, I mean, and this is why you're so atypical for the left, because you acknowledge there are limits. In your vision, you know, give everyone as much opportunity as possible, but you also acknowledge that even if people are very unfortunate in their lot in life, that even giving them as much as possible, they'll amount to nothing. And there are people who can't even flip burgers, for example, to use that, you know, it's a classic example. But many people on the left would still look for reasons and cause and effect and just say, no, we still haven't done enough, because everyone can do anything. And
they'll tell you that you're just playing into the stereotype that stupid people with no gifts and you know, low capability, that's just a stereotype. You're just playing into the stereotype. It's not some inherent thing about them that is causing their problems. And that's something I've actually had a sociologist say to me. Is I brought up the very obvious fucking differences. I believe that she said to me, what did she say? She said something along the lines of, yeah, but you're still just playing into that sort of stereotype. When I was giving you the example of like athletes and all the various different sort of naturally derived from evolution in different environments, specialities, like how, you know, West Africans run fast, East Africans run for a long time, Northern and Eastern Europeans are strong. East Asians can be, you know, high power to weight ratio.
I think I know where that comes from. I know a mathematician who knows even smarter mathematicians than he is, and they're very capable, obviously, and they're doing incredible things with their mind. You know, mathematics far beyond our canon ability. And when you're kind of at that, in the cognitive elite or at the top, there's a tacit assumption, because the things you're doing are easy for you, that everyone else can do it. You know, I'm sure if you ask any of these world-class sprinters, apart from the training, what they do, they just say, oh, I just do it. I forgot what his name is, the current best chess player in the world, Magnus something. But the people ask him, you know, how do you do X, Y, Z? And he just says, I just do it. I mean, so when you're really that talented, there's an assumption, because it's almost there's a sort of reflexivity to it, and it's very easy for you.
Yeah.
I'll give you a really extreme example. What if you grew up as a complete illiterate, but versus somebody who is of decent intelligence, who learned how to read and write and can compose sentences, whatever? And so you say, well, how do you write a paragraph? And you say, oh, I just do it. I mean,
I just put the words.
I just put the words on the paper. I mean, it's meaningless because there's that assumption that these are all just transferable skills. So that sociologist, for example, assuming she's reasonably intelligent, probably just thinks that anything that she can do and grasp is what Joe Schmo, the subpar burger flipper, can do, and it's just not the case. And again, getting back to the central theme, unless we acknowledge differences, individual, group, just it doesn't really matter. And unless we acknowledge that people are different and have different capacities, we will not be able to address this issue because there's that tacit assumption of blank slateism, or however you want to term it. Because this is the operating, I think particularly on the left, the operating mentality of people who just assume that they can do things so everyone else can do them. And that's not universal that's not just unique to the cognitive thing. I think athletes do the same thing. There's a guy is really the guy at the gym who can bench 200 kilograms, and that's a lot for those who don't know. He might say, I just do it, but that I will never ever be able to do that, and so it's kind of useless.
It's from your reference point, you can for obvious reasons you can find it quite hard to imagine certain things outside your reference point if it's that far away. Like in the case of very high-end mathematicians, it's second nature to them. It's quite hard for them to imagine not being good at maths. Or in my case, something that I found out about recently is because I like to talk about things like that, find the reason why. And I was asking women on their opinion about being catcalled and having people publicly show interest in you, or in certain cases even grope you. And I was saying that I like that, and then they said, yeah, but you're a man. And I was like, what do you mean? And they explained to me, it's like, you're tall, I'm not fucking Dwayne Johnson or anything like that, but like I'm considerably bigger than the average guy, and I've got the big fucking caveman eyebrows and shit like that. People aren't particularly, the average person isn't, I don't consider much of a threat, and I'm male. And then when I stopped and thought about it, I thought, holy shit, if I sort of put myself in the average woman's shoes, right, I'm suddenly a foot shorter, and less than half as strong, and I'm smaller. And then imagine if big fucking barbarian motherfuckers are showing sexual interest in me and maybe even groping me, and they're like, I know that for a fact that they're fucking likely twice as strong as me on average, then that suddenly becomes quite a fucking intimidating situation to be in. But yeah,
it's only intimidating when they don't like the man. It's very selective, but that's a separate issue. But yeah,
likewise, it's like I'm completely fine with being sexualized by women that I find attractive. But if they're trolls, then again, that's like a preference thing. But yeah, but so it happens on both ends of the spectrum. It's like where. Actually, it's not really a spectrum in that case, is it? It's more like your perspective and like a scale of knowledge. It sort of overlaps as a spectrum in places where somebody who's got hardly any knowledge, they can't imagine like anywhere up the situation in terms of scope of the situation from a certain point. And then people who are really aware of everything are going to prioritize certain information. Then occasionally they're going to be caught out by that whole they have a much better idea of what's going on, and from their perspective it might actually be quite hard to imagine the perspective of somebody who is completely oblivious to the situation, because they know so well themselves, and it would be alien to them to not know.
Yeah, and I now this is another key issue, is sort of nobody can actually walk a mile in the other person's shoes, but we need to be in a position to acknowledge that there are indeed other shoes, and depending on what shoes you're wearing, you'll be able to do certain things that other people can't, and vice versa. And that can be very impactful in the world. And again, with all the echo chambers and tribalism that seems dominant today, that reality is not really being talked about. And again, this goes back to resources, because if you're really, really bright in today's world market, and that means basically manipulating numbers, then you can do a lot. And if you can't do that, forget about it. You're going to fall behind. And I guess the reason why I'm not very hopeful, I don't know if you are, apart from me being old, is that I just don't see any willingness on the part of policymakers. Because it's all well and good that you and I can sit here on opposite ends of the world and have a conversation about this in good faith. That's actually a really great thing, and it's rare. And it would be even better if more mainstream people on YouTube or the internet could talk about these things and address it. But that still wouldn't have the policy impact that it would necessarily need to have, because we don't make policy. We're not involved in politics. Or maybe one day you will be. You're still young. I don't know. But it needs to transcend this. I mean, you could say this is where it starts, sure. But it needs to transcend our starting point, or the starting point, and go to something much more material that can actually manifest itself in the world at large. And on that front, I see zero progress. In fact, it's a very, very dim and grim prospect in my view.
Yeah, well, can I share my bright young, inexperienced opinion
go
on
ahead.
that? Yeah, no, you're right. How do you tackle that issue? And like people say when like you and me bring up issues like that, they'll say, well, what's the solution then? Huh? If you're so aware of this issue, like, what's the problem? And I think that's fucking stupid when people ask me. It's like, what's the solution? And you're asking one person the solution to all the world's problems. No one person has that. Nobody, not the smartest person in the world, has the answer. But I believe, and this is where things are a bit brighter in my opinion, is that I don't know what the solution is, but I am pretty sure that communication, if we can sort of train in, if we can sort of build the habit in people of like, don't be afraid to be proven wrong by other people. Try and think of the bigger picture. These are sort of, I think for most people, it's you could probably, through some sort of education, increase the likelihood of the good habits associated with keeping it real, for lack of better words, not denying reality, not looking through a highly tribalized lens or anything like that. I think that I quite often preach that education solves all problems. Well, it doesn't solve them necessarily, but it remedies the situation. Education's a great remedy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very left-wing position. Education is the key. I would agree with a strong caveat. It's the type of education. The type of education we've had has not been the key, quite the opposite. It's it's fueling many of the problems we've been discussing. So, my view is that we would fundamentally need to change the type of education that we have. I've been talking about this for years. I started off, you could say, as a kind of amateur specialist in sex differences, and expanded upon that, or grew my circle. Understanding things like evolutionary biology, psychology, how and why men are different, etc. So, and expanding from there. That doesn't exist in the current educational system anywhere I'm aware of. basic numeracy, literacy, that's all well and good, but that doesn't offer you any explanatory power of the world. Now, children are very susceptible to propaganda, to manipulation. Now, I would say don't manipulate children. Teach them the truth. Teach them the facts of the world young, when they're young. Then, whatever their inclinations, and there are different political people are different, fine. But at least they would be dealing with the facts, and they'd be very unlikely to, question them if you think they're inaccurate. But if there's certain things that we just know. Men and women are different. They evolve differently. They have different inclinations. This is one very prominent, obvious example. And this is not something you can contest because there's just no evidence. You could use it. And people would just, there wouldn't be you heard about the James Damore incident, right? At Google?
No, could you tell me?
So James Damore was a Google worker who wrote a memo in which he went into some detail on sex differences and domains of interest. And the idea behind it was to improve Google's efficiency by maybe understanding how men and women operate differently and their interests. And he basically got fired because he was sexism. And he cited
absolutely fucking ridiculous.
He cited all manner of there were lots of academic citations. It was all backed by evidence. There was no scientific information there that was incorrect, put it that way. And so it's one example. Imagine a world where something like that, these differences, everyone just know. Not only were we passively aware of them, which we are, but it would just be obvious, and so there wouldn't be this freak out that happened. Something that happened years ago in the mid 2000s with Larry Summers, the former president of Harvard, making a statement to the effect of that why men tend to be more represented at the upper echelons of mathematics, or even just mathematics in general. Got fired for that, basically, etc. These are the types of things that probably wouldn't happen because people would just say, "Oh yeah, we just know this stuff."
If you tell children, susceptible, children with plastic growing minds, that you can't do or say this, and you can't make these distinctions, you're actually interfering with their learning. You're out of your own fear for fucking, I don't know, offending people, being afraid of acknowledging something yourself. You're imposing something really stupid upon children, and that's just, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, so the idea would be to bombard children with facts, so whatever they end up doing and whatever political direction they end up going in, they could at least just deal with it from a factual perspective. Because though there will be disagreements in policy and what could be done with it, but you need to have a common ground of agreed upon facts before you do that. If, say, the left continues to live in la-la land on matters of human difference, general difference, individual difference, whatever, nothing will get done because they're literally living in the land of Oz. It has nothing to do. Their world has nothing to do with the reality, really, or very little.
Those differences and inherent issues aren't going to not exist if you tell people they don't exist.
On the contrary, they're going to get worse and worse, particularly on the matter that I talk about a lot of cognitive stratification. It's inevitable, and we're going to have to deal with it one way or another. And we can deal with it in a good faith, matter-of-fact way where we just accept certain things as they are and then try to drop a plan, or some people can continue to live in the land of Oz and pretend otherwise up until reality hits them in the face. And that's the thing. You can only dwell in a fantasy so long until reality catches up with you. So that would be my wish going forward. But again, I don't see any education along those lines.
And that's something I quite often have to specify when I talk about education. I don't mean education as it exists in lots of school curriculums today. specifically what you said about that worldly knowledge and just general knowledge, and important things in regards to life, self, others, interactions. Don't like bore children with the minutiae, but just as you teach like general literacy and numeracy, I think you can expose children to facts. I mean, how much would it hurt a child to say to them, just as in the example that I grew up very, like, physically very fast. I was really tall for my age, especially when I was younger, and I'm still tall now, but I was much more so compared to my peers as a child. My mother would say to me, initially she said, you can't start fights because you're too big, you'll hurt other children. And then even if I defended myself later on, it got to the point where my mother said, she was being real about the situation, saying you can't fight people at all because you're too big. You have to just avoid the situation. She was giving me the right information based on a real problem that exists with inherent differences that I followed through with, and it suited me to not, like, to try and avoid fights, and also if I was in a fight, to not hurt, to be aware that I was inherently different to this other person, that I could hurt them and stuff like that, and that would make for problems. Like I could have got kicked out of school and shit like that if I hurt the wrong child who's got a particularly complaining parent, or the wrong teacher walked by, something like that. I don't think it would hurt children to tell them that people are different. That's actually an interesting thing. But I wonder if there's been any studies on this, or anecdotes of people that whoever knows, where the child was told, just I definitely am against people saying, like, oh, you're clumsy, and then the child grows up thinking they're clumsy, and they just think, well, that's just my fate. I think people underestimate the intelligence of children, their learning ability. They learn better than adults. It's part of having the young plastic brain. If you tell them that everybody's inherently different and they have different capabilities based on this, but they should capitalize on learning and working around existing problems. Like if they didn't try to sugarcoat everything and dress it up as like, oh no, the world's nice and fair and fine, and everybody gets along, and there's no issues to be conscientious of. I think that's a far more destructive approach than if you would just be real with your child and say, you shouldn't maybe in the case of bullying, it's like you shouldn't think little of that particular kid because he's got like maybe certain psychological conditions, or he's got a bad background or something like that. Just acknowledge difference, and I don't know, try and foster some sort of open-mindedness.
Well, this ties in well the way the kind of helicopter, sometimes called the helicopter mom generation, children are mollycoddled. They're denied reality. Everyone gets a prize. This all ties in with the unreality model that we've been talking about, where little Timmy can do anything he wants. Of course, you don't want to beat children down with an overly negative worldview. They're still trying to discover things and figure things out. But one of the reasons why things have gotten so out of hand is that your generation in particular has grown up, and I don't know how it is in Kangaroo Land or Kiwi Land, but I would imagine it's quite similar, with this idea that everyone gets a prize. If everyone runs a race, being a participant is enough. And so competition and the results of competition, they pretty much disappear. And the expectation that arises from that long term is that everyone is a winner, and everyone anyone can do anything.
Yeah, no, it's certainly the case here in New Zealand, that mentality of just a medal for merely participating, right? And people naturally like impressive things. People naturally like beautiful people, strong people. They like to see good results in competition. And the reason why we see people watch, they prefer to watch international level male athletes is because they are the most impressive and spectacular in athleticism. In terms of capability, sure on the individual circumstance of, say, Paralympians, or even just a local person who's got like a prosthetic limb or something like that, and they play sports casually. The reason I've heard sociologists say that the reason that, say, males in sport get more coverage than females in sport is just because it's a lack of funding based on a sort of non-progressive idea about it. It's because women, as much as I adore them, they're not as physically capable in a lot of areas. They're more capable in some, which is interesting.
Well, they're more flexible on average.
Yeah, and there's a couple of other things I can't recall off the top of my head, but I've learned about this sort of thing, differences between males and females in health and fitness. But the big spectacular shit that comes with speed, power, strength, and size, and this and that, all those advantages go to males, and people want to look at that. People are less impressed by, well, you can't deny that, like, the highest tier of female athletes tend to be a step behind the male ones. Yeah, so there's all sorts of different areas in which the fear of just being real with the situation. Because I come from the belief that when I say to people, I'm trying to help some certain people with their moods and this, that, and the other, because I do a bit of like amateur counseling. So I have no qualifications or anything, but I've just seen that I can help people, and I like to continue doing that. And I say to people, and it's like, why are you talking about it like this way, being negative about it? And they're saying, I'm just being realistic. And I think that if we can, when they're not actually being realistic, they're genuinely being pessimistic. They're aware of certain problems, but they're also not acknowledging the bigger picture. And I think that people will sort of see the acknowledgement of real things as too dark and just oof. There is a lot of shit things. Life is unfair, for example, is probably something that not a lot of people are happy about. Can't be fair. There's all these terrible things happening in the world, yeah, sure. But another thing that I always say to people that I'm trying to help is, don't focus on the problem, focus on solving the problem, or working on what you can and just accepting what you can't. And that I don't find particularly, from this standpoint, I don't find things particularly negative overall. In fact, I'm just fucking happy to be alive. I see and appreciate probably a lot more than the average person does, and I really enjoy life, even though I'm a fucking poor student with not much experience or accolades or achievements under my belt. But I think that I have a sort of realistic perspective that I can maybe it would, I don't know, I can't see it harming a child to know that these inherent differences, or if the left sort of just gave up the tribalism for a bit to sort of hear the other side of the story. But yeah, I think the main problem with the left, probably the biggest distinction from with me to the average person on the political left, that that's why you brought me on, and the other people were surprised by me. Is that I acknowledge the reality. I don't deny the reality because I'm not afraid of being wrong, and I'm also not afraid of the inherent problems and difficulties and unpleasant things that come from looking at the actual facts of what's going on.
Seems like a good way to end it, as our resident leftist.
Yeah.
As,
token leftist, you guys.
Well, that's actually, you're not the token leftist. That's the problem. I wish you were. Well, I mean, yeah, I suppose you are. You're so standing in for the token leftist, but the reality is you're there's just not almost nobody on the left, and probably not many people on the right, for that matter, would fit your profile. So it's a strange thing.
Yeah, well, yeah. Just one last little thing is that
sure,
it's a problem that exists on both sides, but it's represented more on the left because of, funnily enough, yet again, scientific facts. There's certain personalities that gravitate towards the left, and with those personalities come the sort of fears of things being unpleasant for people, right? Leftists quite often care about people. A lot of them are more playing victim Olympics, but that's a topic for something else. But yeah, that's that's another thing. So yeah, just be real about how things actually are, and I think we should delve into the matters, find out everything we can about the matters, rather than not talk about it.
Yeah. Well, I'd broadly agree with that. Just again, we're a long way away from it. So, but maybe, as I said, this is probably where it can start, and with a tremendous amount of luck and some misplaced hope, maybe there'll be a ripple effect. Maybe you'll be the person to change the world. Who knows? I don't know.
Well, at least we can agree that, so long as there's a few people around who are willing to look at things realistically, there's always potential for those ideas to, be passed on and spread.
Agreed. Well, you don't have a YouTube channel, do you?
I don't know.
No. Okay. Well, maybe one day. Well, that might be an idea, something to consider.
I've considered it. When I get shit under control, maybe I'd like to start. Preaching a bit of understanding more, because I think understanding, just understanding the other side even. But yeah, that's talk for another time.
Yes. Well, nice let me thank Hunter, our pseudo token leftist, for joining us in this discussion. It's been a good discussion, I think, and I think maybe we even had managed to outline some pathways forward. I think they'll probably go ignored, but hey, we made an attempt, and that's something.
You can only try to do what you can with the situation.
Yes, that's definitely the case. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.